women, and men, of course, but women were very much part of it. Now, none of these women were sexually available to the Pacha in any way. He had wives, of course, and Babur and Humayun just had a few. Later on, these grew in numbers. But there were many other women who were not at all sexually available to the Pacha at all. Like Rumina has mentioned, all these aunts and sisters and milk mothers. This slowly grew in number so that by the time of Akbar, there were very many women. But these were a lot of these women were there to serve the various needs of the women themselves. So there were serving women, there were teachers, there were masseurs, there were dancing women for their entertainment, there were tailors, there were all kinds of women. And they were just there to serve the main royal ladies. In addition, you had educators, because education was an extremely important part of the harem and of the education of the young women. So you had mistresses, you had teachers, and then supervising this huge clan of women was an administration. There were the rogas and mansabdars. And all these women, you must remember, they were paid. They had salaries. So in the time of Akbar, the senior women were paid up to 1,000 rupees. And the more junior ones, 50 rupees, and the servant women, 10 or 2 rupees. So they had a job to perform, and they were paid for these duties. And none of these women were, again, as I said, sexually available to the Pacha at all. So this was a very complex place, a very industrious and complex space. And we have an account of how surprised an Englishman was when he came across this, because by then they had created this idea of a very sensuous place which was only for the Pacha. And there was this English physician called John Fryer, and he accidentally saw the harem one day when he had gone to attend to a patient, and they used to hang a curtain between the person, the man who was visiting, and the other ladies. And this curtain fell down, and he saw a space which was filled with women cutting mangoes for achars. And he was so surprised, and he said they were making pickles and achars and doing needlework. And clearly in his account, he was very taken aback because he probably thought that he would see them, beautifying, lying back on the takht and, waiting for the Pasha to arrive. So this was a very different world to the one that they had started creating.
And Ira, what I also discovered through your writing was that not only was the harem inhabited by all these people that you mentioned, there was also this tremendous bonding between women, which I thought was a very important aspect of the harem. And then there was this bonding between, for instance, Gulbadan and Hamida Begum. And I think they died within a year of each other. Yes. And Gulbadan was away for a very long time to Kabul. And Hamida was away, she was the wife of Humayun, incidentally. She was away to Persia for many, many years when Humayun was ousted from India by Sher Shah Suri, if you remember a little bit about your history. And Gulbadan missed Hamida tremendously. And when they were reunited, it was a grand reunion. And so I thought that was also something extremely significant about these women, that they were not jealous. They were not vying for male attention. That there was a relationship of complicity among these women. So perhaps you could tell us a little bit about some of these women who were seen in pairs.
Correct. And they were often, working towards a common cause. So very far from being in opposition to each other, they often had a common aim. Usually this was to foster a preferred prince, whom all of them felt should be the next heir. So for example, when Humayun was struggling to keep his kingdom, he had a lot of opposition from Kamran, his brother, and also Hindal and Askari. And so his major trouble, as much as the other enemies that he had in Hindustan, was to control his brothers. And he would always appeal to the harem, to the women of the harem, and whether those ladies were the actual biological mothers of the other princess or not, they always got together and acted as one to sort of, to protect Humayun and to further his claim as the rightful prince and the rightful Pacha. So it was very interesting to me that they went beyond the bonds of, their own motherly love, for example, because they recognized a common cause. They knew that they had to maintain the Timurid line, and for them that was more important than their own individual needs or longings. And as you said, I found it very interesting to see these bonds between two women. So, as you say, Hamida and Gulbadan. And also Bega Begum, and the senior wife of Humayun. What was interesting to me was Humayun died very early, so Bega Begum was a widow quite early, and there were other wives as well. And Bega Begum, when Akbar became Pacha, she decided to stay on in Delhi because for her that was the space where Humayun had been king even for a short time. And she started building Humayun's tomb there, you know. If you all know about the architecture of Humayun's tomb, which is so famous today with its Timurid dome, I wonder if part of the reason for the architecture being the way it is isn't because Hamida Banu spent those 2 years in Persia with Humayun, absorbed all those influences because they went and they visited many architectural elements in Persia. They were visitors.
In fact, as I read your book, I renewed this interest in myself to go visit Delhi again,
yes,
because we often pass by the Humayun's tomb,
yes,
without going in. I thought that after learning about the way in which,
correct,
his wife was responsible and
yes,
spent, and even had a little house of
house
her own.
bill. She had
And
the
she
Arab
died
Sarai.
there,
Yes,
and there
yes,
was a kind of wifely devotion that we always associate with Hindu women,
yeah,
and never with the Muslim women.
correct.
And I thought that, this book inspired me to go back to Delhi and check out all these places, and now with a different vision altogether.
Yes.
But one thing that I also noticed was that there seems to be a kind of a difference between the earlier Mughal women and the women who came later. And by the earlier Mughal women, I mean Khanzada, who was Babur's elder sister, Gulbadan, who we have just mentioned, who was Babur's daughter, Hamida, who was Humayun's wife, and several other women of that time, and the ones who came later after Akbar. You write in your book, for example, that the earlier women were more free, and at that time you describe the harem as I think I'll use the word that you use, a raucous harem. And you've also mentioned about the kind of textured lives these women led. That, of course, is true of all the women, whether we speak of the earlier ones or the later ones. But with Akbar, there is a little less that we know about these women. Not only because there is less history, in fact, there was more of history with Abul Fazl.
That's right.
But with the court historian Abul Fazl and others, we feel that there is a certain kind of wall of chastity, and that women are confined more and more as against the women who came before Akbar's harem.
Yes, that's definitely the case. And when as you said, as we talk about the women who accompanied Babur and Humayun, they went with them physically, they went with them everywhere. They were peripatetic, they traveled with them, they went into battlegrounds, they went traveling extensively, sightseeing sometimes. I think that can be explained when we remember that the Mughals were Timurids. They were descendants of Timur, and they were very proud to be that. And they followed the Yasa laws of Timur, which said that a man is judged by his household, by his women, by his wife, by how educated she is. So that is the reason why they tend to put so much emphasis on the education of women. So these women were, and the parda was sort of very perfunctory at that time, very porous, There's a visitor, a Spanish ambassador who visits Timur's court, and he says, the women are just in these gardens, there are no walls, they are just tents, and they have this very light sort of, veil on their face, but we can clearly see their faces through it. So even the Mughals, the earlier ones, had this sort of very porous parda. But from the time of Akbar, as you say, that is when we start to see the institutionalization of the harem and the parda. And between Akbar and his great biographer, Abu al-Fazl, of course, who wanted to set Akbar up as this divine king. And so everything had to be perfect. And the raucous harem that we had earlier with the squabbles sometimes between the women, or the women speaking their mind to the emperor very openly, accompanying him, sometimes demanding that he come visit them like Bega Begum used to do. And she would grumble to him and say, why haven't you come and visited me in so many days? You go and see your sisters, you don't come and see me. So I think
It's quite interesting, actually, that Humayun goes to the harem not to meet his wives as much as he goes to meet his aunts.
That's
which
right.
Which again demystifies this whole idea of this extremely sexual
The sexualized aspect. It wasn't at all. It was a question of hierarchy, of protocol, of respect of the women that you respected very deeply because they were carrying the memory of the Timurid heritage, So this kind of aspect of the harem, I think Abu al-Fazl and Akbar wanted to contain in some way. And so for the first time in Agra and then Fatehpur Sikri, they built a physical space, stone walls around the women, and then the women were kind of immured into the space. Now, why this came about exactly, partly it is to do with the creating of a perfect king. You could not have these women wandering around like this without walls. Secondly, it was possibly the influence of the Rajputs, because this was the time when Akbar started marrying Rajput women quite early on in his reign. And the Rajput, if you cast your mind back at this time, the 16th century, was a place where parda had already long existed. In fact, the Rajput women used to keep parda even vis-a-vis their female relatives. So a young bride, for example, had to keep a ghungat in front of her mother-in-law. This is something that the Mughals would never do. The women amongst themselves were completely open. But the Rajput had parda as well. So I have a feeling, and academics do propose this, that as the Rajput women integrated Akbar's court and his harem, and he of course allowed them to bring in all their Hindu rituals and all their traditions. And in addition, the Rajputs had this system that when they married a woman and sent her away to her married house, they would send an entire network of staff around her. So they would send tailors with her, they would send cooks with her, they would send masseuse, they would send dancing girls, they would send priests, exactly. They would send teachers, because they couldn't trust the people that she was marrying into fully. They didn't know what would go with it. So they sent this entire entourage. So this entire entourage of women with their Hindu rituals and ways integrated the Mughal court as well. And I think it was a little bit of a system of osmosis between the Mughals and the Rajput, which meant that they sort of reinforced mutually this idea of a strict parda and the notions of chastity which came along with it.
Some of this we see in the blockbuster Jodha Akbar.
Yes.
But of course, we also realize, I was looking for the name Jodha in the book, and there wasn't any Jodha Akbar, Jodha, who was Akbar's wife. In fact, Akbar's wife was Harka Bai. And I thought that, how on earth? I mean, we thought that her name was Jodha all the time.
That's
but
right.
Jodha is, I think, Jahangir's, one of Jahangir's wives.
That's correct, yes. There's a lot of doubt over this, and people have, people get very, very shocked whenever I say that there was no Jodha Akbar. I think people are shattered to hear this news. The fact is that the first and the major Rajput wife that Akbar married was a woman from the clan of the Kachwahas. So actually the story should have been Kachwaha Akbar, but that doesn't quite have the same ring as Jodha Akbar, And the woman from Jodhpur was Jahangir's wife, so Jodha was associated with Jahangir, so it could have been Jodha Jahangir, but then that didn't happen either.
That doesn't,
no. So yes, that's right. The first woman he married and the mother of his son, Salim, later Jahangir, is Harka Bai. And by the time of Akbar, it was considered, the female body became imbued with the notion of chastity. So it was considered incorrect, disrespectful to even the mention of her name could make her impure. So you were not even allowed to say her name. So it was extremely difficult, even when I was doing my research, to track down the name of Jahangir's mother, Akbar's wife. Because by then they were given titles, Maryam Uz-Zamani and all these grandiose titles behind which the real vulnerable human woman is hidden. There's only one farman which says that Harka Bai is Maryam Uz-Zamani, mother of Salim Jahangir, future Jahangir. So as far as I know, it's Harka Bai and certainly not Jodha.
Somewhere in the middle of the book, there is a very exciting, very engaging chapter that you write, in which Gulbadan and I think Salima Begum, who was Bairam Khan's widow, both of them are planning the Hajj that I mentioned that lasted for longer than 7 years. But they are intercepted by the Portuguese. Now that's the time of the Portuguese coming to India. And by and by, Gulbadan and others are waiting until they are allowed this pass by which they board the ship and then they sail to Mecca. I found it extremely interesting that by and by, almost quietly and subtly, you fill up your book with the presence of the Europeans. The Portuguese, there's a little presence of the Dutch, and then finally you keep hearing about the missionaries who come in almost at the same time. And then by and by, people like Sir Thomas Roe around the time of Jahangir, then British historians as well. But if you read the accounts of the Mughals, if you were to read the biographies and autobiographies of the Mughal people and about those emperors, one realizes that there is hardly any mention of the Europeans. In contrast, the Europeans wrote massive treatises, many histories, memoirs, books filled up with Mughals and what they did, how their women behaved, their marriages, their styles of eating, their feasting, their vulgarities, the violence, their cruelty. And one interesting thing that you mention is that in Jahangir's autobiography, there is only one sentence about the Europeans in contrast with that. And you also mentioned that the Europeans were not even a minor footnote in the history of the Mughals. And in fact, the Mughals often referred to them as those despicable Firangis. And yet what survives today is, or what is read in a very major manner today, is